My sister disabled the smoke alarms because noise hurt her feelings. When I dragged her out of the fire, she had me arrested for assault. When I begged my parents to finally protect me, my mother whispered, "We just want peace in the house." So I stopped speaking. Last night, she sent me a photo of our old living room, blackened, gutted, captioned, "Do you feel better now?" My grandmother demanded I carry my dead grandfather's baby. She'd saved his frozen sperm for 40 years and said I needed to use it to get pregnant immediately and keep his legacy alive. My grandmother had always been obsessed with my grandfather, who died before I was born. She kept his clothes in their bedroom, set his place at dinner, and talked to his photographs like he was still alive. When I was young, I thought it was sweet how much she loved him. She'd tell me I had his eyes, his hands, his spirit. She said I was more his granddaughter than anyone else's because I carried his essence. I didn't understand why she'd make me sit in his old chair or wear his reading glasses until I turned 18, and she finally revealed her plan. That's when she took me to the basement freezer I'd never been allowed to open. "This freezer is full of dry ice, and your grandfather's legacy," she said. 20 vials of his perfect sperm. She explained that she'd been waiting for the right vessel, someone who shared his bloodline but was young and pure enough to carry his seed properly. "He always wanted more children," she said. "You're going to make that dream come true." When I recoiled in horror, she gripped my shoulders. "Don't you understand? You get to bring him back. Part of him will walk this earth again, and you're the only one who can do it. Your eggs plus his sperm equals resurrection." She said already scheduled appointments at a fertility clinic that didn't ask questions. The first insemination was next week. I ran straight to my parents, but they already knew. "It's what he would have wanted," my mother said, not meeting my eyes. I packed a bag that night, but my grandmother had disabled my car and hidden the keys. When I tried walking to the bus station, my father followed in his truck and brought me home. "Where would you even go?" he asked. "She'll find you anywhere." I called the police, but what could I say that didn't sound insane? The operator suggested family counseling. I tried destroying the freezer, but my grandmother had moved the vials to multiple locations. She showed me photos of mini fridges in her friends' houses, safety deposit boxes at different banks. 20 years of planning, she said. "You think I'd keep them all in one place?" The fertility clinic she'd chosen operated out of a strip mall. I went there alone, planning to tell them everything, but the doctor was her old friend from nursing school. "Your grandmother explained your nervousness," he said, patting my hand. "It's natural to be scared about pregnancy, but family is everything." I realized she'd built an entire network to trap me. 3 days before the appointment, I faked appendicitis to get to the hospital, but she came with me. When I tried to tell the nurses, she explained I had anxiety about trying for a baby, and they nodded sympathetically. Every escape route led back to her. She'd made me invisible to anyone who might help. The night before the clinic appointment, I barricaded my door with furniture. She pounded on it, screaming that I was keeping my grandfather waiting. I could hear her dragging something heavy down the hallway. She'd brought her portable freezer to my door, sobbing about how the samples might thaw if I didn't come out immediately. 40 years I've kept him alive in there," she wailed. 40 years of paying for storage, checking temperatures, protecting his future. "You think you can destroy that with a locked door?" The pounding stopped. Then I heard drilling. She was removing my door from its hinges while crooning my grandfather's favorite song. I went to my window, but she'd nailed boards across the outside while I slept. The room had become a cage. My phone was dead, the charger mysteriously missing. She'd planned this for years, and I'd walked right into it. The door fell inward with a crash. She stood in my doorway holding a turkey baster and a cooler, her nightgown splattered with something. "If you won't go to the clinic," she said calmly, "we'll do this the old-fashioned way. Your grandfather didn't believe in modern medicine anyway." Behind her, my parents stood like zombies, trained to never interfere with her will. I tried to push past them, but my father grabbed me. He was crying as he held my arms. "Just let her do it," he whispered. "She'll never stop. She'll never let you go." My mother helped drag me to my bed while my grandmother prepared her supplies with practiced efficiency. "I was a nurse before I met your grandfather," she said, drawing the thawed sperm into a syringe. "I could get you pregnant in my sleep." She approached with the syringe like it was a sacred ritual. "Your grandfather was the only man who ever mattered. I'm not waiting one more minute for his dreams to come true." I thrashed, but my parents held me down. My grandmother pushed my legs apart with clinical detachment. She kissed the vial like a holy relic. "You're coming back to me now, sweetheart." She positioned the syringe between my legs. My mother turned her face away but kept her grip on my ankles. The room spun. The last thing I saw before I passed out was my grandmother preparing her turkey baster, finally ready to resurrect the dead. I woke up on my bed, still dressed, with sunlight streaming through the gaps in the boarded windows. My body ached from struggling against my parents' grip. The memory of last night crashed over me like ice water. My grandmother, the syringe, the turkey baster. I shot upright, checking myself frantically. Everything seemed normal. Had she actually done it? Had I escaped somehow? My bedroom door hung crooked on its hinges. The furniture I'd used as a barricade lay scattered across the floor. On my nightstand sat a glass of orange juice and a note in my grandmother's spidery handwriting. "Drink this, sweetheart. You need your vitamins now." I stumbled to my feet, legs shaking. The house was eerily quiet. Through my doorway, I could see the hallway stretching toward the stairs. No sign of my family. I crept forward, avoiding the creaky floorboard near my dresser. In the kitchen, my grandmother hummed while scrambling eggs. She wore her favorite apron, the one with embroidered roses that my grandfather had given her. My parents sat at the table, staring at their coffee cups like they held the secrets of the universe. My grandmother turned when she heard my footsteps. Her face lit up with a joy that made my skin crawl. She rushed over and placed both hands on my stomach, pressing gently. "How are we feeling this morning? Any nausea?" "That's perfectly normal in early pregnancy." She guided me to a chair before I could pull away. "I made your grandfather's favorite breakfast. He always said eggs were brain food for babies." I pushed the plate away. My father's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. My mother traced patterns in her coffee with a spoon, creating tiny whirlpools that went nowhere. "I need to use the bathroom," I said. My grandmother's smile never wavered. "Of course, dear, but don't lock the door. We wouldn't want you fainting and hitting your head, not in your condition." I walked slowly, testing my body for any sign of what she might have done while I was unconscious. In the bathroom, I found the pregnancy tests she'd already laid out on the counter. 5 different brands, all still in their boxes. A sticky note on the mirror read, "Test every morning until we see those beautiful 2 lines." I splashed cold water on my face, trying to think. The bathroom window was painted shut, had been for years. Even if I broke it, the drop to the concrete patio would hurt. Maybe hurt the baby she thought was already growing inside me. The baby. My grandfather's baby. The thought made me gag. I returned to find my grandmother had pulled out photo albums. She patted the seat beside her on the couch. "Come look at your grandfather when he was young. See if you can spot the family resemblance." The photos showed a man I'd never met, frozen in time. Him in his Navy uniform. Him holding my infant mother. Him standing beside the old Buick he'd restored. In every picture, my grandmother stood beside him, clutching his arm like she was afraid he'd float away. "He had the most beautiful hands," she said, tracing his image with one finger. "Surgeon's hands," I always said, "just like yours." She grabbed my wrist, comparing my fingers to the man in the photograph. "Perfect match. That baby will have his hands too." I yanked away. "There is no baby." Her smile turned pitying. "Not yet, but there will be." I made sure of that last night. My stomach dropped. "What did you do? What needed to be done? You were so upset, fighting like that. I couldn't risk you hurting yourself or damaging the samples, so I gave you something to help you sleep. Just a little sedative in your dinner. Then I could work without all that thrashing." The room tilted. I gripped the couch arm to steady myself. "Don't look so worried," she continued. I was very gentle, used proper medical technique. The turkey baster was just for show, to scare you into cooperating. I have professional equipment. 20 years of planning, remember? I've thought of everything. My mother finally looked up from her coffee. Her eyes were red-rimmed, hollow. "She's telling the truth." I held the flashlight while she worked. "It's done." 3 vials, my grandmother added proudly. I wasn't taking any chances. Used 3 whole vials to make sure it took. Your grandfather always said anything worth doing was worth doing right. I ran back to the bathroom and vomited until nothing came up but bile. My grandmother appeared in the doorway with a cool washcloth and ginger ale. "Morning sickness already? Oh, that's a wonderful sign. I was sick as a dog when I was pregnant with your mother. Threw up every morning for 3 months straight." She pressed the washcloth to my forehead with practiced care. "Your grandfather would make me dry toast and bring it to bed. Said it was the least he could do since I was carrying his child." There's something deeply unsettling about how methodical this grandmother is. 40 years of keeping frozen sperm, building a whole network of people, even having her old nursing friend at that clinic. I shoved past her, heading for the front door. Locked. The windows in the living room had new bars installed on the inside, painted white to match the trim. When had she done that? How long had she been preparing my prison? "I had those put in last month," she said, following my gaze. "Told the contractor we'd had break-ins. Can't be too careful with a baby on the way." I spun to face her. "I'll get in termination of pregnancy." The words hung in the air like a challenge. My grandmother's face went very still. Then she smiled again, that terrible, knowing smile. "No, you won't. Every clinic in a 100-mile radius has your photo. I told them you're my mentally ill granddaughter who has delusions about being pregnant. Said you've been trying to get unnecessary procedures. They were very understanding. Gave me their word they'd call me if you showed up." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through emails. "See? Responses from every single one. They're so grateful when family members take an active role in their loved one's care." I sank onto the couch. She'd thought of everything. 20 years of planning, she'd said. 20 years of waiting for me to be old enough to carry her dead husband's child. "Why me?" I whispered. "Why not my mother? Why not do this years ago?" My grandmother sat beside me, smoothing my hair like she used to when I was small. "Your mother was never right for it. Too much of her father in her, not enough of mine. But you. From the moment you were born, I knew. You had his eyes immediately. That same gray-blue, like storm clouds. And as you grew, it only became clearer. The way you held your pencil, the way you laughed, even your walk, all him." She pulled out another photo album, this one full of pictures of me through the years. Next to each one, she'd placed a corresponding photo of my grandfather at a similar age. The resemblance was unsettling. "I've been preparing you without you knowing it. The vitamins I've been giving you since you were 12, prenatal, building up your body for this moment, the family medical history I had you fill out last year, genetic screening. Everything has been leading to this." My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window and stared out through the bars. His shoulders shook silently. "Don't mind him," my grandmother said. "He's emotional about becoming a grandfather, even if it is in an unconventional way." "It's sick," I said. "You're sick. This whole thing is insane." She patted my knee. "You'll understand when you hold that baby. When you see your grandfather's features in that tiny face. The love you'll feel. It's indescribable. And I'll be right there with you. We'll raise him together. I've already started converting the guest room into a nursery." I stood on shaking legs. "I'm leaving. You can't keep me here forever." "Actually, I can. Power of attorney. Had it drawn up years ago when you had that appendectomy at 16. You signed papers while you were groggy from anesthesia. Among them was a document giving me medical power of attorney in case of emergency." She pulled out a folder from the side table. "And what's more of an emergency than a pregnancy and a young woman showing signs of mental distress?" The papers looked official. My signature at the bottom, shaky but recognizable. I remembered that surgery, remembered signing things while the nurse held my hand, told me it was routine paperwork. "That's not legal," I said. "You tricked me. Prove it. You were of age. You signed willingly. No court in the world would overturn it without clear evidence of coercion. And who's going to believe you over a concerned grandmother trying to help her pregnant granddaughter through a difficult time?" She stood, gathering the photo albums. "Now, let's talk about prenatal care. I've scheduled your first appointment for next week. My friend from the clinic will come here, make it easier for you. We'll do ultrasounds right in the living room. Won't that be nice?" I spent the rest of the day searching for a way out. Every door locked from the outside, every window barred or boarded, my cell phone missing, the landline disconnected. Even the knives had been removed from the kitchen, replaced with plastic cutlery. My grandmother shadowed my every move, chattering about baby names and nursery themes. "Your grandfather always liked traditional names. James for a boy, after his father. Elizabeth for a girl, after his his mother, though I suppose we'll know it's a boy, won't we? The men in his family always had boys first. That night, she made me take vitamins while she watched. Folic acid is crucial in early pregnancy, and these omega-3s will help with brain development. Your grandfather was so smart, scored in the 99th percentile on his Navy aptitude tests. I palmed the pills, planning to flush them later, but she checked my mouth, under my tongue, made me drink a full glass of water while she watched my throat to ensure I swallowed. I know all the tricks, she said. 20 years of planning, remember? My room had been transformed while I was downstairs. The boards on the windows now had decorative curtains hung over them. A baby monitor sat on my dresser. The camera pointed at my bed. Books about pregnancy lined my bookshelf where my novels used to be. I'll be watching, my grandmother said, indicating the monitor. In case you need anything, morning sickness can come at any time. She kissed my forehead before leaving, pulling my door closed. I heard the click of a padlock on the outside. I lay in the dark, hand pressed to my stomach. Was something already growing inside me? Could I feel it? The thought made me want to tear my skin off. 3 vials, she'd said. 3 vials of my dead grandfather's sperm, forced inside me while I was unconscious. The violation of it made me shake with rage and disgust. But rage wouldn't get me out. I needed to think, to plan. My grandmother had 20 years of preparation, but I had something she didn't expect. I had her obsession to use against her. She needed me healthy for this pregnancy she believed was starting. That meant she couldn't hurt me, couldn't substance me too heavily, couldn't let me deteriorate. She needed me cooperative eventually. That gave me leverage. I stared at the baby monitor's red light in the darkness. Somewhere in this house, my grandmother was watching that feed, waiting for signs of morning sickness or distress, waiting for her dead husband to be reborn through my body. I closed my eyes and began to plan. The morning brought my grandmother's footsteps outside my door at exactly 6 o'clock. The padlock clicked open and she entered carrying a tray of breakfast and more vitamins. I pretended to be asleep while she set everything on my nightstand and checked the baby monitor's angle. After she left, I examined the pills more carefully. The prenatal vitamins looked legitimate, but 2 unmarked white tablets worried me. I hid them in a tear in my mattress and swallowed only the vitamins, knowing she'd check later. My first real chance came during my supervised shower. My grandmother sat on the toilet lid, humming while I washed behind the frosted glass door. I noticed the bathroom cabinet's mirror had a loose screw. While the water ran, I worked it free with my fingernail until I could slip my hand behind and feel around. My fingers found something cold and metal, a spare key. I palmed it and finished my shower, wrapping myself in the robe my grandmother held out. The key pressed against my palm as she braided my wet hair, talking about how pregnancy made hair grow thicker and shinier. Back in my room, I tested the key on my padlock. Too small. I tried it on the window locks. Nothing. Finally, I found it opened my old jewelry box, which my grandmother had moved to the top shelf of my closet. Inside, I discovered my driver's license, some cash she'd confiscated, and most importantly, my old flip phone from high school. The battery was dead, but the charger might still be in the garage. My grandmother called me down for lunch. She'd made tomato soup, crackers, and ginger tea. My parents sat at the table like mannequins, barely acknowledging my presence. I forced myself to eat while my grandmother discussed nursery paint colors. After lunch, she announced we were going shopping for maternity clothes. My heart raced. Finally, a chance to get out of the house. But my hopes crashed when she brought out a wheelchair. She explained that pregnancy made women dizzy and she couldn't risk me falling in public. My father wheeled me to the van while my mother walked behind, carrying my grandmother's purse. At the mall, my grandmother kept one hand on the wheelchair at all times. When I tried to speak to a sales clerk, she quickly interrupted, explaining I had severe anxiety and to please be patient with me. The maternity store felt like another trap closing around me. My grandmother held up flowing dresses and elastic-waisted pants, discussing how my body would change over the coming months. She bought thousands of dollars worth of clothes in increasing sizes, enough to last through an entire pregnancy. On the drive home, I spotted a police car at a red light. I tried to catch the officer's eye, but my grandmother noticed and quickly pulled a sunshade across my window. She reminded my father to take the back roads home, avoiding what she called stressful traffic. That evening, she introduced a new routine. She brought out a blood pressure cuff and thermometer, recording my vitals in a notebook. She measured my waist with a tape measure, marking the number down with satisfaction. She even had me step on a scale, noting my weight as a baseline. During dinner, I noticed my mother kept glancing at me with something like guilt in her eyes. When my grandmother went to get dessert, my mother leaned forward slightly. Her lips moved like she wanted to speak, but my father grabbed her wrist. They stared at each other until my mother looked away. Window bars painted white to blend in. That's interior design meets maximum security prison. She really went for the cozy captivity look here, complete with baby monitor surveillance and padlocked bedroom doors. My grandmother returned with sugar-free pudding, explaining that gestational diabetes ran in families. She watched me eat every bite, then supervised my evening vitamins. This time, I couldn't hide the white pills. She stood over me until I swallowed them, then checked my mouth thoroughly. Within an hour, I felt drowsy. The white pills were sedatives, keeping me compliant and sleepy. I fought to stay conscious, but my eyelids grew heavy. The last thing I saw was my grandmother adjusting the baby monitor, ensuring she could watch me sleep. I woke in the middle of the night with a strange clarity. The sedatives had worn off enough for me to think clearly. I crept to my closet and retrieved the flip phone, then listened at my door. The house was silent. Using a bobby pin, I managed to lift the window lock just enough to create a gap. Cool air rushed in. I pushed the window up inch by inch, wincing at every creak. The bars outside were solid, but I could fit my arm through. I reached down and felt along the exterior wall until my fingers found what I was looking for, the outdoor outlet where we used to plug in Christmas lights. I grabbed a lamp cord and carefully fed it through the bars, plugging in my phone charger. The phone would need hours to charge, but it was a start. I pulled everything back inside and closed the window, my heart pounding. The next morning, my grandmother seemed suspicious. She checked my pupils, felt my forehead, and asked if I'd slept well. I acted groggy from the sedatives, which seemed to satisfy her. She mentioned that the doctor would visit tomorrow for my first prenatal checkup. During breakfast, she pulled out a new addition to her her collection, a fetal Doppler monitor. She explained she'd be checking for a heartbeat soon, probably within the next few weeks. The thought of her pressing that device against my stomach, searching for signs of my grandfather's resurrection, made me physically ill. I spent the morning pretending to read pregnancy books while actually studying my grandmother's routines. She checked on me every 30 minutes. She kept the house keys on a chain around her neck. She had my father patrol the backyard twice a day. Every detail mattered. After lunch, she decided I needed fresh air and exercise. She walked me around the backyard like a prisoner, pointing out where she planned to put a swing set. The elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, waved from her garden. My grandmother waved back cheerfully, calling out that I was expecting and feeling shy about it. That afternoon, while my grandmother prepared dinner, I heard her on the phone with someone. She mentioned my name, confirmed an appointment, and discussed payment in cash. Through the crack under my door, I could see her feet pacing as she talked. She was expanding her network, bringing in more people to ensure her plan succeeded. My mother brought me dinner that night. She set the tray down with shaking hands and turned to leave, but I grabbed her sleeve. She froze, not meeting my eyes. I pulled her closer and whispered urgently about what grandmother had done, begging for help. My mother's face crumpled. She admitted she knew it was wrong, but felt powerless. My grandmother had something on her, some secret from years ago that would destroy her life if revealed. She couldn't risk it. She pulled away and fled the room, leaving me alone with my meal and my despair. The sedatives that night seemed stronger. I fought them harder, forcing myself to stay partially conscious. Through heavy eyelids, I watched my grandmother enter my room around midnight. She approached my bed and placed her hand on my stomach, whispering to the baby she believed was growing inside me. She told my grandfather's ghost about the nursery plans, about the names she'd chosen, about how his legacy would live on. She promised to raise this child exactly as he would have wanted. Her obsession had consumed any remnant of sanity or maternal love. I was just a vessel to her now. The next morning brought the doctor. He arrived with a portable ultrasound machine and medical bag. My grandmother had me change into a hospital gown and lie on my bed. I tried to tell him this was against my will, but my grandmother quickly explained I had prenatal anxiety and delusions. The doctor, clearly paid well for his discretion, ignored my protests. He performed a basic examination while my grandmother watched eagerly. When he conducted the ultrasound, finding nothing yet, my grandmother wasn't discouraged. She said it was too early but wanted to establish a baseline. The doctor agreed to return weekly for monitoring. After he left, my grandmother was in high spirits. She showed me the ultrasound printout of my empty uterus, saying soon we'd see a tiny heartbeat. She'd already put the image in a frame labeled baby's first photo, with a date. That night, I finally got my phone charged enough to power on. I muted it immediately and checked for signal. 1 bar. I tried calling 911, but the call wouldn't connect. I sent text messages to everyone I could think of, but they all failed to send. My grandmother must have installed a signal blocker. Desperate, I tried the phone's primitive internet browser. It loaded slowly, but I managed to access my email. I typed a frantic message to my best friend from college, explaining everything. Just as I hit send, my door opened. My grandmother stood there with a handheld signal detector, the kind used to find hidden cameras. It was beeping steadily, pointed directly at me. Her face showed no surprise, only disappointment. She held out her hand for the phone. I had no choice but to give it to her. She examined it, saw my failed attempts at communication, and shook her head sadly. She explained she'd installed signal blockers throughout the house months ago. The only working phone was her landline, which she controlled. As punishment, she moved my mattress to the floor and removed all furniture I could stand on. She installed a new lock on my closet and confiscated everything except basic clothing. The baby monitor was joined by 2 more cameras, covering every angle of the room. She also introduced a new rule. I would now sleep in restraints to prevent any midnight escape attempts. She produced medical-grade wrist restraints, the kind used in hospitals, and secured me to eye bolts she'd installed in the floor. I could move enough to be comfortable, but not enough to cause trouble. The next few days blurred together in a haze of sedatives and supervision. My grandmother maintained her cheerful facade, acting like we were preparing for a joyous occasion rather than perpetrating a nightmare. She read to my stomach from children's books, played classical music for the baby's development, and continued her obsessive documentation of my body. My father grew increasingly uncomfortable with the restraints and cameras, but my grandmother shut down his weak protests. She reminded him of his complicity, of how he'd helped hold me down that first night. He was trapped by his own guilt and fear. On the 5th day of my new imprisonment, my grandmother made a mistake. She left her notebook on the kitchen counter while answering the door. I glimpsed pages of meticulous notes about my cycle, my body temperature, optimal fertilization windows. She'd been tracking me for years without my knowledge. But more importantly, I saw a page titled Contingency Plans. It listed various scenarios and responses. If I escaped, she had people watching bus stations and airports. If I went to police, she had documents proving my mental instability. If I managed to get pregnant by someone else to ruin her plan, she had ways to claim the baby was still my grandfather's. The doorbell had been her doctor friend returning with blood test results. He confirmed I wasn't pregnant yet, which frustrated my grandmother. She decided to attempt another insemination immediately, despite the doctor suggesting they wait for optimal timing. That night, she prepared her medical supplies while my parents stood guard outside my room. I begged them to stop her, but they wouldn't even look at me. My grandmother entered with her syringe and cooler, ready to force more of my grandfather's genetic material into my body. This time, I fought differently. Instead of physical resistance, I went completely limp. I forced my body to be dead weight, making it harder for her to position me. I also hyperventilated, making myself dizzy and causing my muscles to cramp. My grandmother grew frustrated, worried I might hurt myself and damage my reproductive system. She decided to wait until I calmed down, but I kept up the act. I made myself vomit the dinner I'd eaten, claiming the stress was making me sick. She couldn't risk attempting insemination while I was in this state. Finally, she gave me a stronger sedative and decided to try again tomorrow, but I'd bought myself time. And during my hyperventilation act, I'd noticed something crucial. The eye bolt holding my left wrist restraint had loosened slightly from my thrashing over the past few days. The wood around it was starting to splinter. together. I spent hours that night working on that bolt, using the only tool I had, the restraint itself. By pulling at specific angles, I could feel it giving way bit by bit. My wrist was raw and bleeding by morning, but the bolt was definitely looser. My grandmother noticed my injured wrist and treated it with antibiotic cream, scolding me for struggling against the restraints. She wrapped it in gauze, which actually helped hide the damage I was doing to the bolt. She was so focused on protecting my reproductive health that she missed the real threat. During my supervised bathroom break, I overheard my parents arguing downstairs. My father wanted to stop this madness, saying it had gone too far. My mother reminded him they were both accomplices now. If I ever got free, they'd face consequences too. They were trapped in a prison of their own making. Why does the grandmother have military-grade signal blockers just ready to go? Was she planning this specific scenario for years? Or does she always prepare for hostage situations? The way she pulls out that signal detector right when the phone gets charged feels too convenient, like she was waiting for exactly this moment to happen. That afternoon, my grandmother announced she'd hired a private nurse to help monitor me. The woman would arrive tomorrow and stay in the guest room, the one not being converted to a nursery. This meant constant professional supervision and less chance of escape. I worked frantically on the bolt that night, ignoring the pain in my wrist. By dawn, I could pull it almost completely free, but I had to be strategic. If I escaped at the wrong time, I'd be caught immediately. I needed to wait for the perfect moment. The nurse arrived after breakfast. Catherine was a stern woman in her 50s who'd clearly done this kind of work before. My grandmother introduced me as her special needs granddaughter who required constant care during a difficult pregnancy. Catherine accepted this without question, probably used to discretion in her private practice work. Catherine took over my medical monitoring with cold efficiency. She drew blood, checked my vitals, and examined my injured wrist. She noted the damage in her chart but said nothing. She was being paid not to ask questions. My grandmother seemed relieved to have professional help. She spent the morning showing Catherine around, explaining my condition and the importance of maintaining strict routines. Catherine nodded along, absorbing every detail of my captivity. That night brought a new horror. Catherine prepared an IV line, explaining she'd be administering nutrients and hormones to optimize my body for pregnancy. I realized my grandmother was escalating her medical interventions, using her nurse friend to turn me into a perfect incubator. As the IV dripped into my arm, I felt my hope slipping away. The bolt was loose, but with Catherine watching, when would I ever get the chance to use it? My grandmother had thought of everything, planned for every contingency. 20 years of obsession had built the perfect trap. But then I noticed something. Catherine had a routine too. She checked on me every 2 hours during the night, like clockwork. Between 2 and 4 in the morning, she took a longer break, probably sleeping. That was my window. I spent the next day memorizing every sound in the house, the creak of the third stair, the squeak of the kitchen door, the hum of the refrigerator. I needed to navigate in complete darkness and silence. My grandmother visited that evening with photo albums again. This time, she showed me pictures of my grandfather's childhood home, explaining how she'd saved money to buy it back. That's where we'd raise the baby, she said, in the same rooms where my grandfather had played as a child. The sedatives that night seemed lighter. Maybe Catherine had adjusted the dose, or maybe I was building tolerance. Either way, I stayed conscious enough to watch the clock. At 2:15 a.m., I heard Catherine's footsteps fade toward the guest room. I waited another 15 minutes to be sure, then began working the bolt free. It came loose with a soft pop that sounded like thunder in the silence. My left hand was free. I used it to unbuckle the right restraint, my fingers clumsy from hours of restricted blood flow. Finally free, I stood on shaking legs. The fourth line was still in my arm. I carefully removed it, pressing gauze against the puncture to stop any bleeding that might leave a trail. Every movement felt too loud, too obvious. I crept to my door and listened. Nothing. The padlock was on the outside, but I'd noticed the door frame was old wood. Using the metal bolt I'd freed, I worked at the screws holding the lock plate. Years of paint made them stiff, but desperation gave me strength. One screw came free, then another. The lock plate hung by a single screw now. I paused, listening for any sign I'd been heard. The house remained silent. I worked the final screw until the plate fell away, catching it before it could clatter to the floor. My door swung open silently. The hallway stretched before me, dark and full of obstacles. I knew my grandmother's room was at the end, my parents' room beside it. Catherine was in the guest room downstairs. I had to pass them all to reach freedom. I moved in slow motion, testing each floorboard before putting my weight on it. The third stair did indeed creak, so I stretched my leg to skip it entirely. The kitchen door squeaked, but only if opened quickly. I eased it open over 30 seconds, holding my breath. The kitchen was my next challenge. My grandmother had removed all the knives, but I needed supplies. I found car keys in the drawer, not mine, but my father's spare set. I grabbed a jacket from the hook and slipped a water bottle into the pocket. The front door was my biggest obstacle. It had multiple locks and an alarm system, but I'd watched my grandmother disable it every morning and knew the code. My grandfather's birthday. I punched it in with trembling fingers and heard the soft beep of success. I unlocked each deadbolt slowly, wincing at every click. Finally, the door was open. Cool night air hit my face like freedom itself. I wanted to run, but forced myself to close the door quietly behind me. My father's truck was in the driveway. I'd never driven it, but desperation is a quick teacher. I released the parking brake and let it roll backward down the slight incline, not starting the engine until I reached the street. The engine roared to life, shattering the night's silence. I didn't wait to see if lights came on in the house. I drove, taking random turns, putting distance between me and my prison. I had no phone, no money beyond the few dollars from my jewelry box, and nowhere safe to go, but I was free, for now. I drove for an hour before stopping at a 24-hour gas station. The attendant gave me strange looks. I was still in pajamas with bandages on my wrist. I asked to use their phone, claiming car trouble. He handed it over reluctantly. I called the only number I'd memorized besides 911, my college roommate Sarah. She answered on the 5th ring, groggy and confused. I explained as quickly as I could, begging her to come get me. She lived 3 hours away but promised to leave immediately. I waited in the truck, watching for any sign of pursuit. Every car that passed made my heart race. Had my grandmother discovered my escape yet? Had she activated her network of watchers? Dawn was breaking when Sarah's car pulled up beside me. She took one look at my condition and pulled me into a fierce hug. I broke down completely, sobbing out the whole story as she held me in the parking lot. Sarah wanted to go straight to the police, but I explained about my grandmother's preparations, her documents claiming I was mentally unstable. We needed evidence first. Sarah suggested we go to a hospital, get my injuries documented, get a substance test to show what they'd been giving me. But as we drove toward the nearest hospital, I spotted something that made my blood freeze. My grandmother's car, parked outside the emergency room entrance. She'd anticipated this move too. Sarah quickly turned around, taking back roads toward her apartment. We needed a new plan. My grandmother had 20 years of preparation, but I had something she didn't expect. A friend she didn't know about. Someone outside her network of control. We reached Sarah's apartment as morning traffic began building. She lived in a complex with security gates, which provided some comfort. Inside, she helped me shower and gave me clean clothes. The normalcy of it felt surreal after weeks of captivity. Sarah was a law student, which proved invaluable. She started documenting everything, photographing my injuries, writing down my timeline of events, researching the legality of power of attorney obtained under dubious circumstances. She explained that we needed to build a case before approaching authorities, but we didn't have much time. My grandmother would be searching everywhere. She had resources, connections, and obsessive determination. Sarah's apartment was a temporary haven at best. As if summoned by my thoughts, Sarah's phone rang. Unknown number. She answered cautiously, then handed it to me with wide eyes. It was my grandmother. She spoke calmly, asking if I was safe, saying she was worried sick. She claimed I'd had an episode, that I'd forgotten to take my medication, that everyone was looking for me. She promised if I came home, we could work everything out. No more restraints, no more locks, just family taking care of family. I hung up without responding. The fact that she'd found Sarah's number so quickly meant she was already tracing my connections. We had to move fast. Sarah suggested we drive to the city where her law school was located. She had a professor who specialized in family law and abuse cases. He might know how to navigate my grandmother's web of preparations. It was a 2-hour drive, but staying put felt more dangerous. We packed quickly, Sarah grabbing legal textbooks and her laptop. As we loaded her car, I noticed a van parked across the street that hadn't been there before. My paranoia might have been justified. It looked like the type of vehicle my grandmother's medical friends might use. We left through the back exit of the complex, Sarah taking a circuitous route to the highway. She kept checking the mirrors while I watched for any signs of pursuit. The normal world passed by outside, people heading to work, living their ordinary lives, unaware of the nightmare I was fleeing. Halfway to the city, Sarah's phone rang again. This time it was my mother. Sarah put it on speaker at my nod. My mother was crying, begging me to come home. She swore they just wanted to help me, that my grandmother was beside herself with worry. She claimed I wasn't well, that I needed my medication, that I was putting myself and the baby at risk, the baby that didn't exist, the medication that kept me sedated, the help that was actually imprisonment. I told my mother I was never coming back and ended the call. Sarah immediately turned off her phone's location services, realizing they might be tracking us. Sarah's law school connections coming in clutch while grandma's already tracking down phone numbers like some kind of twisted detective. That's when you know your escape plan needs an escape plan from the escape plan. We reached the law school by noon. Sarah's professor, Dr. Gutierrez, agreed to see us immediately after hearing the urgency in her voice. His office was cluttered with books and case files, the walls covered in degrees and certifications. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally jotting notes. When I finished, he leaned back with a grave expression. He explained that cases like mine were more common than people realized, family members using medical authority to control relatives. The key was proving coercion and documenting the abuse. My grandmother's preparations actually worked in my favor in one way. They showed premeditation. He made calls to colleagues while Sarah and I waited. Within an hour, he'd arranged for several things: a restraining order hearing for the next morning, a psychiatric evaluation to counter any claims of mental illness, and a safe house for me to stay in that night. The safe house was a nondescript apartment used for domestic violence victims. The address wasn't publicly listed, and security cameras covered every entrance. For the first time in weeks, I felt marginally safe. Sarah stayed with me, working on her laptop to compile our evidence. That evening, we watched the news and saw my face. My grandmother had reported me missing, claiming I was a vulnerable adult who disappeared without her medication. The report mentioned I might be confused or disoriented and asked anyone who saw me to call immediately. Dr. Gutierrez called to warn us this was expected. My grandmother was trying to control the narrative, painting herself as the concerned caregiver. Tomorrow's hearing would be crucial. I needed to present as calm, rational, and credible despite everything I'd endured. I barely slept that night, starting at every sound. Sarah stayed awake with me, reviewing possible questions for court. She'd found similar cases online where family members had used medical power of attorney for control. Some had won their freedom, others hadn't. Morning came too quickly. Sarah had bought me professional clothes for court, a simple blazer and slacks that made me look older, more credible. We met Dr. Gutierrez at the courthouse, where he introduced me to the lawyer he'd arranged, a woman named Patricia who specialized in abuse cases. The courthouse felt both safe and terrifying. Security guards and metal detectors meant my grandmother couldn't physically reach me, but legal proceedings meant facing her again. Patricia explained the process. We were seeking an emergency protective order and challenging the power of attorney. Then I saw them. My grandmother entered with her own lawyer, followed by my parents. She looked smaller than I remembered, older. She'd dressed conservatively, playing the part of the worried grandmother perfectly. When she saw me, her face lit up with what looked like genuine relief and love. It was unsettling. The hearing was in a small room rather than a full courtroom. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, reviewed the paperwork while we took our seats. My grandmother sat across from me, maintaining that loving, concerned expression. My parents flanked her, my mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Patricia presented our case first. She outlined the forced insemination attempts, the imprisonment, the sedation, the elaborate network of control. She submitted photos of my injuries, the medical documentation from the psychiatric evaluation that confirmed I showed no signs of mental illness beyond trauma responses. My grandmother's lawyer countered smoothly. He presented years of medical records showing my grandmother's devoted care, doctor's notes about my anxiety and delusions, the power of attorney documents, even character references from neighbors praising my grandmother's dedication to family. Then came testimony. I took the stand first, Patricia guiding me through my story. I kept my voice steady, focusing on facts rather than emotions. I described the freezer, the syringes, the restraints. The judge listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Cross-examination was harder. My grandmother's lawyer questioned why I'd never reported this before, why I'd lived with her so long if she was abusive, why there was no physical evidence of the insemination attempts. He suggested I was confused, possibly influenced by my friend, definitely in need of family support. My grandmother testified next. She was brilliant. She admitted to being overprotective, maybe too controlling, but only out of love. She claimed I'd misunderstood her desire for me to have children someday as something more sinister. The medical supplies, just her old nursing equipment she'd shown me out of nostalgia. The restraints, necessary after I'd become violent during what she called a psychotic episode. She cried at exactly the right moments. She spoke of her deep love for me, her fear for my safety, her desperation when I disappeared. She even admitted to making mistakes, but painted them as the actions of a grandmother who loved too much rather than a captor obsessing over her dead husband. My parents supported her story. They testified about my recent behavioral changes and paranoid delusions. My father mentioned finding me talking to myself, planning elaborate escapes from imaginary threats. My mother described my refusal to take prescribed medication, my aggressive outbursts, all lies, but delivered with convincing emotion. The judge called a recess. Patricia said it was going better than expected, but warned me judges were often reluctant to restrict family access without overwhelming evidence. The photos helped, but my grandmother's counter-narrative was strong. During the break, my grandmother approached, despite Patricia's attempts to intervene. She grabbed my hands, tears in her eyes, and begged me to come home. She promised things would be different, that she'd get me help, that she loved me more than life itself. For a moment, I almost believed her. The grandmother who'd raised me was still in there, twisted but real. When we reconvened, the judge delivered her decision. She granted a temporary restraining order preventing my grandmother from coming within 500 feet of me. However, she didn't fully revoke the power of attorney, instead ordering a full competency evaluation and review in 30 days. It was a partial victory at best. My grandmother looked devastated, but accepted the decision gracefully. As we left the courthouse, she called out that she'd always love me, that she'd be waiting when I was ready to come home. My parents followed her, my mother shooting me one last pleading look. Outside, Patricia explained our next steps. The 30-day review meant I needed to establish independence quickly, find a job, secure housing, continue therapy. Any sign of instability could be used to reinforce my grandmother's claim that I needed supervision. Sarah offered to let me stay with her while I figured things out. Dr. Gutierrez provided referrals for trauma counselors and support groups. Patricia said she'd work on fully dissolving the power of attorney before the review. I had a team now, people who believed me. But as we drove away from the courthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. My grandmother had planned for 20 years. She wouldn't give up after one legal setback. She'd find another way, another angle. The restraining order was just paper, and paper couldn't stop obsession. That night in Sarah's apartment, I finally felt the full weight of my freedom. No cameras watching, no locks on the doors, no forced medications. I could walk outside whenever I wanted. The simple acts of choosing my own meals and deciding when to sleep felt revolutionary, but freedom came with its own challenges. I had no money, no job history, no references who weren't connected to my grandmother. My education had been controlled and limited. I was starting life over at an age when most people were established. The task felt overwhelming. Sarah helped me create a resume, padding my limited experience with volunteer work I'd done under my grandmother's supervision. We applied for jobs online, focusing on entry-level positions that didn't require extensive background checks. I needed income fast to prove independence. 3 days later, my grandmother made her next move. A package arrived at Sarah's apartment addressed to me. Inside was a baby blanket, hand-knitted in soft yellow yarn. A note in my grandmother's handwriting said simply, "For when you're ready. All my love, Grandma." It was a message. She still believed I was pregnant, or would be. The restraining order hadn't changed her fundamental delusion. If anything, it might have reinforced her belief that I was acting irrationally due to pregnancy hormones. The blanket was both a threat and a promise. She wasn't giving up. I started therapy with Dr. Snow, a specialist in family trauma and coercive control. She helped me understand that my grandmother's behavior stemmed from complicated grief and mental illness, not from love. The obsession with resurrection through pregnancy was her way of denying my grandfather's death, frozen in time like his sperm. Dr. Snow also helped me recognize the extent of the conditioning I'd endured. Years of subtle preparation had made me doubt my own perceptions. Even free, I found myself taking prenatal vitamins out of habit before remembering I didn't need them. Deprogramming would take time. A week into my freedom, I got a job at a bookstore. The manager, an older woman named Joan, didn't ask too many questions about my sparse resume. The work was simple but satisfying. Stocking shelves, running the register, recommending books to customers. It felt like rejoining the world. Sarah accompanied me to find an apartment. We looked at tiny studios I could barely afford, but each one represented independence. I settled on a 4th-floor walk-up with good locks and a fire escape. Really curious why the grandmother sent a hand-knitted baby blanket 3 days after losing in court. That's such a specific choice when she could have tried calling lawyers or filing appeals instead. It was cramped and dingy, but it was mine. The 30-day review approached quickly. Patricia prepared me extensively, gathering documentation of my employment, housing, and mental health treatment. We practiced potential questions, anticipating how my grandmother might try to undermine my progress. My grandmother had been busy too. Private investigators had been asking my neighbors neighbor's questions. Someone had called my employer claiming to be checking references, probing for any signs of instability. She was building a case of her own. The review hearing was more formal than the first. This time, we were in a proper courtroom with a different judge, an older man who seemed less sympathetic to my situation. My grandmother had brought more supporters, family friends who testified about her character and my supposed issues. The proceedings felt like a trial of my sanity. Every aspect of my life was scrutinized. Why had I chosen such a small apartment? Was I eating properly? Taking care of myself? The judge questioned why I'd cut off all family contact instead of trying to work things out. My grandmother presented new evidence. Security footage of me looking disheveled at the gas station the night I escaped. Testimony from Catherine about my erratic behavior during captivity. Even a statement from a distant relative claiming I'd always been troubled. But Patricia had evidence too. My employer testified that I was reliable and competent. Dr. Snow explained how my behavior was consistent with trauma responses, not mental illness. Sarah described the night I'd arrived at her apartment and the injuries I'd sustained. The most powerful moment came when Patricia introduced evidence we'd discovered through subpoena. My grandmother's financial records showing thousands spent on fertility treatments over the years, payments to doctors willing to perform ethically questionable procedures, and receipts for medical equipment no normal grandmother would need. The judge deliberated for what felt like hours. When he returned, his expression was unreadable. He revoked the power of attorney completely, stating that regardless of my mental state, I was an adult capable of making my own decisions. The restraining order would remain in place indefinitely. My grandmother's composure finally cracked. She stood up, shouting that I was making a terrible mistake, that I was throwing away my grandfather's legacy. Court officers had to restrain her as she begged me to reconsider, to think about the family I was destroying. My parents let her out, both of them crying. I'd won. Legally, I was free. But standing in that courtroom, watching my family fall apart, victory felt hollow. They were still my family, twisted and broken as those relationships had become. Part of me mourned for the grandmother who'd raised me, even as I celebrated freedom from what she'd become. Patricia warned me to stay vigilant. Legal victories didn't always translate to real-world safety. My grandmother might respect the restraining order, or she might not. Obsession didn't always follow legal boundaries. I needed to be careful, maybe for the rest of my life. I threw myself into building my new life. Work at the bookstore expanded to full-time. I made friends with co-workers and regular customers. Therapy continued weekly, slowly untangling years of manipulation. Some days were harder than others, but forward momentum kept me going. 6 weeks after the hearing, I saw my mother at a grocery store. She was alone, looking older and sadder than I remembered. We made eye contact across the produce section. For a moment, I thought she might approach, but she simply nodded and walked away. It was acknowledgement and goodbye in one gesture. My apartment gradually became a home. I bought secondhand furniture and hung posters on the walls. I adopted a cat from the shelter, naming him Phoenix for both of our second chances. Life developed routines that were mine to choose, but reminders of my past surfaced unexpectedly. A customer at the bookstore mentioned freezing her eggs, and I had to excuse myself to breathe through a panic attack. Baby carriages made me anxious. Medical offices triggered fight-or-flight responses. Trauma had left invisible scars. 3 months into my freedom, the packages started again. Not to my apartment. My grandmother didn't have that address, but they appeared at my workplace, always without return addresses. Baby clothes, parenting books, prenatal vitamins, each one a reminder that she was still watching, still waiting. Joan helped me document everything and file police reports, but without direct threats or contact, there wasn't much they could do. The packages were creepy, but not illegal. My grandmother had found a loophole in the restraining order. I considered moving to another city, starting completely fresh, but running felt like letting her win. This was my home, my life. I'd fought too hard for it to abandon it now. Instead, I installed security cameras and varied my routines. Hypervigilance became my new normal. 6 months after my escape, I met someone. David was a regular customer who lingered to chat about books. He was patient and kind, never pushing when I was vague about my past. Our first date was coffee in a public place, my choice. He didn't question my need for control and visibility. Telling him about my grandmother was terrifying. Who would believe such a story? But David listened without judgment, held my hand when I cried, and offered to walk me home when I felt unsafe. He didn't try to fix me or minimize my experience. He simply accepted my reality. The packages stopped for a while after David started spending nights at my apartment. Maybe my grandmother realized I was moving on, building a life she couldn't touch, or maybe she was planning something new. The silence felt more ominous than the packages. My first birthday in freedom was bittersweet. Sarah threw me a small party with friends from work and therapy group. David made a cake from scratch. It was everything a birthday should be. Chosen family celebrating another year of life. But I couldn't help remembering birthdays with my grandmother before the obsession consumed her. That night, I found a package on my doorstep. Not baby clothes this time, but a photo album. Pictures of me growing up, carefully curated to show only happy moments with my grandmother. The last page held a single photo. My grandfather as a young man, holding a baby. The resemblance to me was undeniable. A note tucked inside read, "You can't run from who you are. He's in your blood, waiting to return. When you're ready to fulfill your destiny, I'll be here. All my love forever, Grandma." I burned the album in my sink, watching years of memories turn to ash, but I kept the note as evidence and a reminder. My grandmother would never stop believing in her delusion. I'd have to stay strong enough to resist it forever. The year anniversary of my escape arrived with another package at the bookstore. This time it contained a medical bracelet engraved with my name and the words, "Grandfather's Legacy." Joan intercepted it before I could see it, but her worried expression told me everything. My grandmother was escalating again. David suggested we take a weekend trip out of town, just to clear my head. We drove to a cabin his friend owned, 3 hours from the city. The distance felt like breathing room. We hiked during the day and played board games at night, pretending we were just a normal couple on a normal vacation. But Sunday morning, I woke to find David's car tires slashed. The cabin's owner called to ask if we'd given anyone the address. Someone had been calling, claiming to be family with an emergency. My grandmother's reach extended further than I'd imagined. We managed to get a tow back to the city, but the message was clear. There was nowhere I could go that she couldn't find me. David stayed calm throughout the ordeal, but I saw the worry in his eyes. He was beginning to understand the true scope of what I was dealing with. Back at my apartment, I found Sarah waiting outside my door. She'd received a visit from a woman claiming to be a social worker, asking questions about my mental health and living situation. The woman had no official identification and fled when Sarah threatened to call the police. Patricia advised me to document everything meticulously. The slashed tires, the fake social worker, the medical bracelet, it all painted a picture of escalating harassment, but without direct contact or explicit threats. Legal options remained limited. The restraining order only covered physical proximity. I changed my routines again, taking different routes to work, shopping at different stores, but the hypervigilance was exhausting. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, startling at unexpected noises. Dr. Snow increased our sessions to twice weekly, concerned about the toll the renewed harassment was taking. 2 weeks later, my mother appeared at the bookstore. She didn't approach me directly, just browsed the shelves while shooting glances my way. When Joan asked if she needed help, she purchased a pregnancy guide and left. The message wasn't subtle. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living in fear, couldn't keep letting my grandmother control my life from a distance. I needed to take back some power. With Patricia's guidance, I drafted a cease and desist letter, formally demanding all contact and harassment stop immediately. Patricia warned it might provoke an escalation, but I was tired of being reactive. The letter was sent to my grandmother's house by certified mail, requiring a signature. I wanted her to know I wasn't hiding anymore. The response came faster than expected. Within days, I received a letter from my grandmother's lawyer. She was petitioning for a wellness check, claiming she had evidence I was suffering from delusions and needed immediate psychiatric intervention. Phoenix the cat probably thinks his owner's family drama makes his shelter backstory look like a Disney movie. Slashed tires, fake social workers, and pregnancy guide power plays sound pretty wild for a bookstore employee's Tuesday. Attached were affidavits from her doctor friends, all expressing concern about my deteriorating mental state. Patricia immediately filed a response, but the damage was done. 2 police officers arrived at my apartment for the wellness check. They were professional but thorough, asking about my medications, my support system, my mental health treatment. I remained calm, showed them my therapy records, my employment verification. They left satisfied, but the intrusion felt violating. My employer received a similar visit. Someone had reported concerns about an employee with mental health issues having access to cash registers and customer information. Joan defended me fiercely, but I could see the doubt creeping into my coworkers' eyes. The whisper campaign was effective. David suggested I move in with him. His apartment was in a security building with doormen and cameras. It felt like admitting defeat, but practicality won. We spent a weekend transferring my belongings, leaving no forwarding address at my old building. The packages found me anyway. They arrived at David's building, addressed to me at his apartment number. Baby monitors, BR ast pumps, a hospital gown with baby grandfather embroidered on it. The doorman started recognizing the pattern, intercepting packages before they reached us. Sarah discovered how my grandmother was tracking me. A private investigator had been following me for months, documenting my movements, my relationships, my daily patterns. Sarah's law school connections helped her identify him, a retired cop who specialized in family reunification cases. We confronted him outside David's building with Patricia present. He claimed he was just doing a job, helping a concerned grandmother locate her mentally ill granddaughter. When Patricia threatened legal action, he agreed to drop the case, but we all knew my grandmother would just hire someone else. The psychological warfare intensified. Calls to David's employer asking about his relationship with a mentally unstable woman. Fake reviews of the bookstore online mentioning the dangerous employee who worked there. Anonymous reports to animal control about my cat being neglected. Each attack was deniable, unprovable, designed to destabilize my life without violating the restraining order. My grandmother had evolved her tactics, using systems and bureaucracy as weapons. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. Dr. Snow helped me recognize the pattern. My grandmother couldn't force me to carry her delusion anymore, so she was trying to destroy the life I'd built without her. If I couldn't be her vessel for resurrection, I couldn't be allowed to thrive independently either. The breaking point came when I discovered I was actually pregnant. David and I had been careful, but no method is foolproof. The irony was crushing. After all my grandmother's forced attempts, it happened naturally with someone I chose. The 2 pink lines on the test felt like fate mocking me. I knew immediately what I needed to do. This pregnancy was my choice, my body, my decision. David supported whatever I decided. Sarah drove me to a clinic 2 towns over where no one would recognize me. The procedure was quick, the recovery manageable. I felt nothing but relief, but somehow my grandmother knew. Maybe she still had people watching the clinics despite their promises. Maybe the private investigator hadn't really dropped the case. Within a week, the packages changed. Now they contained memorial cards for baby grandfather, funeral programs for the legacy lost, photos of my grandfather with murdered stamped across them. Patricia filed for an expanded restraining order, including harassment by proxy. The judge was sympathetic but explained the legal limitations. Without proof my grandmother was directly sending the packages, without explicit threats, options were limited. The system wasn't designed for this kind of psychological warfare. I started fighting back differently. Instead of hiding, I became visible. I shared my story in therapy groups, warning others about coercive control and reproductive abuse. I volunteered at a women's shelter, helping others escape family abuse. I turned my trauma into purpose. My grandmother hated it. The packages increased, now including printouts of my volunteer activities with notes like spreading lies and betraying family. But I didn't stop. Every person I helped felt like reclaiming power she'd tried to steal. David proposed on a quiet Tuesday evening. No fanfare, just the 2 of us in his kitchen. He knew marriage meant my grandmother might escalate further, but he wanted to face it together. I said yes, but we agreed to a courthouse house wedding with only Sarah and Joan as witnesses. No announcements, no social media, no paper trail. We married on a Thursday afternoon. The judge who performed the ceremony was the same one who'd revoked my power of attorney. She smiled warmly, remembering my case. It felt like coming full circle, from legal captive to legally bound by choice. My grandmother found out within days. The packages now came addressed to my married name, filled with divorce papers, annulment forms, articles about invalid marriages. But they felt desperate now, the last gasps of a delusion losing its power. I got promoted at the bookstore, becoming assistant manager. Joan was grooming me to take over when she retired. I'd built something my grandmother couldn't destroy: competence, trust, genuine relationships. The life she'd tried to prevent was flourishing despite her best efforts. A year into my marriage, my father called the bookstore. Joan handed me the phone reluctantly. His voice sounded old, tired. He wanted me to know my grandmother had been hospitalized. A stroke, brought on by stress and obsession. She was asking for me. I hung up without responding. David held me while I cried, not for the grandmother in the hospital, but for the one who'd raised me, who'd loved me before the obsession consumed her. That grandmother had been gone for years, replaced by a stranger wearing her face. The packages stopped after her stroke. My mother sent one final letter, telling me my grandmother was in a care facility, her mind increasingly confused. She spent her days talking to my grandfather's photo, planning a nursery for a baby that would never exist. The obsession had finally consumed what was left of her. I felt free but hollow. The enemy I'd defined myself against was gone, leaving me to figure out who I was without that opposition. Dr. Snow helped me work through the complicated grief of losing someone who'd been both caregiver and captor. Life settled into something approaching normal. David and I adopted a dog to keep Phoenix company. I took over the bookstore when Joan retired. We hosted dinner parties with friends who knew our story and loved us anyway. Ordinary life felt extraordinary after everything. On the second anniversary of my escape, I visited my grandfather's grave. I'd never been there before. My grandmother had always gone alone. It was a simple headstone with military honors. I left flowers and tried to feel something for this man whose death had shaped my life so profoundly. I told his grave that his legacy would end with him. No resurrection, no continuation, just peaceful rest. Whatever dreams he'd had for more children had died with him 40 years ago. My grandmother's inability to accept that had nearly destroyed us all. As I walked away, I felt the last chains of her obsession break. I was free not just legally or physically, but psychologically. The grandfather I'd never met could rest. The grandmother I'd lost to grief could fade. I could live. That evening, David and I cooked dinner together, Phoenix weaving between our legs. We talked about vacation plans, home improvements, ordinary futures. No packages arrived. No investigators lurked. No one tried to control my body or choices. I'd won not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through daily acts of independence. Every choice I made for myself, every relationship I built, every day I lived freely was a victory. My grandmother's 20 years of planning had ultimately failed against my simple insistence on autonomy. The woman who demanded I carry my dead grandfather's baby was gone, lost to her own obsession. The granddaughter she'd tried to control had become someone she never could have imagined, free, whole, and entirely my own person. It wasn't the ending she'd planned, but it was the one I chose. Thanks for tagging along while I tried to make sense of all these weird little moments. Definitely one of those stories that keeps you guessing. Subscribe for more content like this.